Hey guys, welcome back to the Grace Students Podcast. My name is Bryan, and by this time you are well familiar with Scott. And it's good to be joining you again today. We want to talk to you about something that we all deal with, something that perhaps none of us enjoy, and it's confrontation.
I definitely don't like confrontation. Anyone who knows me would say I'm probably the most passive person when it comes to having to correct or bring about conflict. I'm just not that person.
So just kind of right off the bat, what do we mean when we say confrontation or conflict? What are we referring to?
So I think it could be a couple different things. But I think most importantly for me, it would be, how do I want to phrase this? It would be someone that, or an event that would happen that maybe you see someone falling, like we've talked about belief and unbelief, falling into unbelief, and now you need to see where that person's heart is. And so you have to ask some pretty tough questions. That could bring about conflict, especially if they are not wanting to see that as sin or as a moment of unbelief. But now I'm going to ask you, what do you see as conflict?
You can't do that. You can't just turn the question on me.
Oh,
You know the podcast, Unwritten Rules.
I know.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different aspects of confrontation. One, I think, is what you described, maybe in a discipling context where you're confronting sin. I think another area of confrontation is confronting somebody with the gospel. We don't often think of it as confrontation, but I guess by that I mean someone who is not a Jesus follower saying, "Here's something you need to think about." So that's, I think, another area of confrontation. And then maybe even not in either one of those is just normal everyday interactions with people where something happens, like you stole my library book,
right,
and I have to turn it in or it's going to be overdue.
Yeah.
Like, give me it back. Or I think about my kids, like they're constantly confronting each other. Like, you stepped on my backpack. Like you looked at me wrong, whatever. I think there's some of those confrontations that maybe we jump to too quickly. But at the same time, some of those need to happen as well. Everyday confrontations with, how come you didn't get that project done when you said you would, or, we're working on this group project and you didn't do your part.
It's that expectations thing.
Yeah. So I mean, what do you think underlies why we don't want to confront people? Or for those of us that enjoy calling people out, why do we love confronting people?
Yeah, I mean, on my side, and it's interesting, I'll debate people. If it's a fair debate, I can debate or converse or have a dialogue, however you want to say it, all day long, even if it's heated and we're on opposite sides. But for me, when it comes to conflict, it comes down to, one, I either am afraid, I'm fearing them, and putting their reaction over what the truth is, and saying, you know what, no, I'm more fearful of how they're going to respond than what I'm called to do as as a follower of Jesus. Or two, it could be doubt in myself that I'm going to provide the right answer or the right words or whatever, and I could drive them further into sin or give them a unrealistic view of God. Those are the main ones for me, and so those are things that they're tough to work through and get over.
Yeah, and so is it safe to say that from that angle of things, the primary reason that confrontation is an issue is fear of the response or the result of that confrontation?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think the flip side of that for people who love to call other people out or point out other people's issues is that the reason they love that confrontation is because it makes them look good. Like, it propels on the other person faults and issues. And like, I did my part of the group project. Why didn't you? I mean, that's ultimately why that confrontation is enjoyed. And so I would say each of those reasons on both sides of that reveals something about our own hearts, and then like every situation we talk about reveals something about our hearts. So, but I think in these contexts, there are times when we need to figure out how do we confront people with the right motive, because we know that fearing others and their response is not good, right?
Right.
That's not understanding who God is, and then wanting to make ourselves look good by pointing out other people's faults, equally not as good. So how do we confront people the right way? Like when confrontation does need to happen, whether it's with the gospel in a discipling relationship or in the everyday, ordinary conversations, how do we do that in a way that is biblical?
And that's a good question because it's something that I'm still working through, but there are a couple of things that I've learned. And the number one thing is whatever the conflict is you need to figure out how you get back to who God is and what He has done for us. And I know that's something, like you've said, we've talked about a lot, but it's what we're to do. And so once you need to get your mindset back into that of who God is. Because once, if you're on my end, I'll talk from my experience. Once I put, whomever I need to have a conversation with up against God, if God doesn't completely engulf that person, I don't have the right view of God.
Yeah.
But assuming that I'm in the right view of God, I should have no fear of that person. That person may rip me apart. They may call me whatever. They may, whatever it is. I may, quote, lose a friend in that moment. But compare that to who God is,
Right.
And if that's how their response is, you one need to say, I'm finding my satisfaction in God, in Jesus, and two, you need to understand that they're responding that way, but they're a sinner. They're they're no worse than me. I'm no better than them. And so I would respond that way too in some circumstances.
Sure.
And so you need to have grace for that person as well. And so it's definitely a balancing act. But that also allows you to, in the event someone does react poorly or not in a way that you would want them to, there's grace for that. And I think that's something that we often are afraid of. We don't want to be talked to in a specific way. But once you put those two things in order, size them up against God, and then realize that there is grace for that person, and they need it in that moment. If they're spouting off in that kind of response, they could use some truth.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you make a good point there, kind of about the two opposite sides of things. We talk about the 4Gs a good bit, and, God is glorious and God is gracious. Both speak to those sides of that confrontation idea. God is glorious, so He always tips the scale. He always gets more weight than whoever that is we're fearing. And God is gracious, so that means, we don't have to prove ourselves, but other people don't have to prove themselves to us either. And so that's, both sides of that come into play. But you're right, that goes back to who God is, right? And forgetting who God is, which then means I forget who I am because of who He is. And I think that's a huge part of confrontation, is making sure we have the right motive, right, when it happens. So I think, some practical advice Jesus talks about in Matthew 18, if you do need to confront somebody, or you have an issue, or Jesus phrases it in a way that if your brother sins against you, go talk to them and say, man, this happened, and can we talk through this? And if they're reticent to listen, and they're like, whatever, then you grab another person or two and say, hey, this is a situation, I really feel like this is something we need to work through. And then if that doesn't do it, then hopefully you're able to say to somebody, and this is back to being plugged into a local church, right? This is a discipline process that happens in the local church, that you say, man, like this person is not responding to their sin. What do we do? So then hopefully the elders and the shepherds are involved, and we're able to say, man, this is something that is now a bigger issue because this person has sinned against you and doesn't care about it. But the whole premise of Matthew 18 is love for the other person. And so Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 13 very heavily about the idea that if we can do all kinds of stuff, and if we don't do it in love, it really means nothing. It's like a loud, obnoxious noise and doesn't have any value. And so I think understanding that biblical confrontation has to be driven by love for the other person, whether that's in a gospel way where I'm concerned for this person's eternity. So that's why I'm sharing the gospel. That's why I'm going to confront, not like I'm going to beat you over the head with the truth because I know it and you don't. But then I think the second area that we talked about in discipling, you want to see somebody come back to Jesus, someone who has either sinned against you or sinned in a way that they can't see, or maybe it's just flat out rebelled, and you want to call them on that. You have to make sure your motive is love for that person. I mean, when we say love, we mean the other person's best interest in mind, right? Not like, what am I going to get out of this? And I think the same thing is true for wanting to point out people's faults. I mean, like, if that's our motivation, then we're in sin, right? And we're not going to point out people's faults if we love them to make ourselves look good. We're gonna come alongside and say, I have issues too, and I just want you to know that I care about you and I love you. And I think that's when confrontation is biblical.
Yeah, and in today's culture, I mean, it's so easy to take these circumstances and completely blow them out of proportion. I mean, we've gotten very good at adding gasoline to fires.
Yeah.
With social media, it's so easy to, and just the hysteria that comes up over social media. You get into a conflict with someone and they delete you, or they write a not so nice comment about you. It can just be awful.
Or you've ever seen one of those statuses where you're like, I don't know what that person's referring to, but like somebody did something, and now it's like super vague. But
and the gossip starts, and it's okay. Let's try to play the FBI here, and piece together what little information we have, and try to come up with what's happening. And that's again not where you want to be. And that's not to say that if you're out there doing that there's no grace for you.
Right.
I mean, we all fall into these mistakes, but that's where you need to have people whom you can walk up with and talk to about the issue. Don't rely on yourself, and if you and if maybe a couple other friends can't come to an agreement on something, it's not like, hey, well, my last resort is I'm going to social media.
Right.
You should never use...
Everybody's going to know what I think about this person.
Yeah. You should never use that as a weapon.
Agreed.
And so many people do. And so that would just be another...
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because it's tempting to hide behind the screen and just kind of lob stuff out there, and without much thought for how it's going to be received or our motive in that.
Yeah.
And we're quick to type without checking our motives.
And that can be something, too, that prohibits people from wanting to get into relationship with people.
Yeah.
Bad experience. Where they say, you know what, I was good friends with someone, I shared something with them, and the first time we got into a fight, it was all over social media. But that's where, again, you still have to love. You still have to give people grace.
And the paradox with that is that love calls us to be selfless.
Yeah.
Right? Love calls us to think of the other person. And most often when we get into a confrontation or some kind of conflict, it's driven out of our selfishness. Not always, but often. And so I think it would go a long way for us to say, what is going on in my heart right now? And is love for this person that I'm confronting, or I need to confront, or I just confronted, is that the driving factor here? And if it's not, then you can be sure that confrontation is not going to go well.
Yeah, what's the source of that confrontation?
Yeah.
And what is your heart's role in the reason it's gone the way it's gone? Because again, you can't expect the other person to come back and seek forgiveness or whatever if you're still holding on to a grudge. So you need to get your heart right in in that moment of conflict before you go and try to go after the other person.
Yeah. So I think the way to wrap this is to say, if there's a situation in your life where you feel like you do need to confront somebody, stop and pray for the Spirit to work in your heart to make sure that your motives are right, to then follow through with that. And if you have a situation where you're worried about confronting someone that needs some confrontation, the same thing, right? Pray and say, okay, this is what I need to say. Give me the courage to say that and make sure my motives are right. So I think that the prescription is the same in both instances, but if we're not careful, we'll end up in two different places.
Yep.
So confrontation is a part of life, and we do want to point out that as we wrap here, that this is a topic that was submitted by one of our students.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So we're grateful for the feedback. We put it out there. Hey, what should we talk about? And confrontation was one of those. So thank you for that. And that's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. But there's always the next episode.
There is.
Lord willing.
Lord willing.
See you guys.
See ya.